The atmospheric pressure within the docking hub of the Kethvara station was calibrated to a precise, suffocating density that favored the avian respiratory systems of the presiding species. Yet Representative Kalen Thorne stood amidst the swirling nitrogen-rich haze without the assistance of a localized breather. To the surrounding Keth, whose hollow-boned frames were draped in iridescent silks that shimmered with every twitch of their four-winged appendages, Thorne appeared as a dense, immovable monolith of bone and soft tissue. He was a creature of high gravity and blunt force, a biological anomaly in a sector of the galaxy that had long ago traded physical hardiness for the grace of vacuum shaping and light-stitch architecture. The Keth did not understand the human insistence on physical presence in diplomatic parley. They viewed the meat-space interaction as a primitive relic of a species that had yet to fully digitize its consciousness. Thorne, however, knew that the subtle scent of human sweat and the rhythmic thumping of a high-pressure heart served as a subconscious reminder to the delicate Xenos that beneath the pleasantries lay a predator designed for the crushing depths of a planetary well. The High Arbiter of the Keth, a spindly creature whose plumage was stained with the deep indigo of the ruling caste, gestured with a spindly talon toward the panoramic viewing port that overlooked the fractured remains of the asteroid belt. The Keth had spent 3 centuries meticulously carving those stones into geometric masterpieces, turning raw mineral into a lattice of aesthetic perfection. To them, the belt was a monument to their mastery over the chaotic elements of the universe. To the humans, who had recently arrived on the fringes of this sector in their rusted, kinetic-shielded hulks, the belt was nothing more than a source of fuel and shielding. The tension between the two species was not born of ancient blood feuds or ideological crusades, but of a fundamental disagreement on the value of matter. The Keth worshipped the form, while humanity worshipped the function. This misalignment had reached a tipping point when a human mining frigate accidentally pulverized a sacred spire that the Keth had been sculpting for 80 years, an act the humans described as a navigational correction, and the Keth described as a cosmic blasphemy. Thorne watched the Arbiter's movements, translating the rapid-fire clicks and whistles through the neural implant hummed behind his left ear. The translation was cold and clinical, stripping away the poetic flourishes the Keth prized so highly. The Arbiter was demanding reparations that amounted to the total surrender of the human colony on the planetoid designated as Ferrum Prime. It was an absurd demand, one predicated on the assumption that the humans would fold under the threat of the Keth's superior energy weaponry. The Keth fleet was a marvel of elegance, their ships constructed from solidified light and magnetic fields that could slice through traditional hull plating like a hot wire through wax. They moved with a synchronization that suggested a hive-mind efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaotic, decentralized command structure of the human expeditionary force. Thorne felt the familiar itch of adrenaline, a chemical byproduct of his ancestry that the Keth had long ago bred out of their own lineage. He knew that the Arbiter saw him as a slow, clumsy animal, unaware that the very biology the Keth disdained was the source of humanity's greatest strength, the ability to endure. The dialogue continued for hours, a grueling exercise in linguistic gymnastics. Thorne remained standing, his boots anchored to the deck plates, while the Keth drifted on localized gravity tethers, their movements fluid and effortless. The Arbiter spoke of the sanctity of the celestial bodies, of the music of the spheres that the humans had interrupted with their discordant vibrations. Thorne responded with the dry, terrifying logic of logistics. He spoke of caloric intake requirements, of the thermal output necessary to maintain human life in the void, and of the sheer kinetic energy required to move a mountain of iron from one orbit to another. He didn't offer apologies for the destroyed spire. Instead, he offered a calculation of the minerals lost in its destruction. This perceived coldness further incensed the Arbiter, whose crest began to vibrate with a high-pitched hum that signaled genuine biological distress. The Keth were not used to being ignored on an emotional level. They were a species that lived and breathed through the resonance of their environment. To encounter a creature that seemed to exist entirely within its own internal combustion was deeply unsettling to them. As the sun of the system, a bloated red giant, began to cast long, bloody shadows across the station's interior, the Arbiter reached the limit of its patience. It declared that if the humans did not vacate Ferrum Prime within 3 orbital rotations, the Keth would be forced to harmonize the planetoid, a euphemism for a total orbital bombardment that would scour the surface of all biological life. Thorn didn't blink. He didn't even shift his weight. He simply looked the Arbiter in its multifaceted eyes and told the creature that humanity had spent 10,000 years trying to harmonize with a planet that was actively trying to kill them, and they had eventually decided it was easier to just break the planet's spirit instead. He explained that humanity didn't fear the fire. They had been the ones who brought the fire into the dark in the first place. The Arbiter dismissed him then, a flick of a wing that sent Thorn toward the exit, but the human representative stopped at the threshold. He turned back and told the Arbiter that while the Keth built their civilization out of light, humans built theirs out of the things light couldn't penetrate. The walk back to his shuttle was a lonely journey through the crystalline corridors of the Keth station. Thorn could feel the eyes of the station's inhabitants on him, their gazes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. They saw him as a dying breed, a remnant of a more violent, less enlightened era of galactic history. They didn't see the scars beneath his skin, the reinforced carbon fiber lattice that replaced his ribs, or the secondary heart that pumped oxygenated blood through his veins at a rate no natural organism could sustain. They saw a scavenger, a gutter dweller of the cosmos. Thorn boarded his shuttle, a squat, ugly craft of dull gray titanium that looked like a thumbprint on a polished mirror. As the airlock cycled, the hiss of pure oxygen and the smell of ozone filled the cabin, and Thorn finally allowed himself to exhale. He tapped a sequence into the console, opening a secure channel to the command ship, hovering just outside the system's edge. He didn't report on the failed diplomacy. He simply gave the order to begin the hardening process of the Ferrum Prime bunkers. High above the planetoid, the human fleet began to move. It wasn't a graceful movement. It was a series of violent bursts from chemical thrusters and the groaning of metal under stress. These ships were not works of art. They were industrial tools, slabs of lead and steel designed to absorb radiation and deflect kinetic impacts. They didn't shimmer. They absorbed the light of the red giant, turning a bruised, ominous purple in the gloom. The crews aboard these ships were men and women who had been raised in the crushing gravity of Earth or the claustrophobic corridors of mining outposts. They were people who understood that in the vacuum of space, the only thing that mattered was how much pressure you could take before you popped. They watched the Keth fleet gather, a swarm of glowing needles preparing to weave a tapestry of destruction, and they did what humans have always done when faced with an overwhelming force. They dug in. They didn't look for a way to win. They looked for a way to make the other side regret the attempt. On the surface of Ferrum Prime, the miners and engineers were already at work. They weren't building temples or monuments. They were sinking shafts miles into the crust, turning the entire planetoid into a honeycomb of reinforced concrete and lead. They were installing massive thermal sinks that could dissipate the heat of 1,000 laser strikes into the core of the world. They were preparing to turn the very ground beneath their feet into a weapon. The Keth viewed the planet as a canvas, something to be admired from afar. The humans viewed it as a shield, something to be worn. As the first Keth scouts began to take their positions, Thorn looked out from his shuttle at the vast, uncaring darkness. He knew that the coming conflict would be ugly, brutal, and entirely devoid of the elegance the Keth so dearly loved. He knew that the humans would lose ships, they would lose lives, and they would lose the respect of every enlightened species in the quadrant. But he also knew that when the Keth finally brought their hammers down, they would find that the iron they were trying to forge was already far harder than they were. The transition from peace to war in the vacuum is often silent, marked only by the bloom of distant explosions that look like dying stars. When the Keth finally opened fire, it wasn't with a roar, but with a silent, blinding flash of coherent light. The first beam struck the human forward observation post, a small station that had been positioned to monitor the belt. It didn't explode, it simply ceased to be, its atoms scattered into a fine mist of ionized gas. The Keth celebrated the efficiency of the strike, their sensors recording the perfect conversion of matter to energy. They expected the rest of the human fleet to scatter, to realize the futility of their position and flee into the deep black. Instead, the human ships moved closer together, overlapping their sensor arrays and interlocking their point defense grids. They didn't fire back immediately. They waited, like a hunter in a thicket, letting the Keth exhaust their initial capacitors. They were waiting for the Keth to get close enough to feel the weight of the iron. Thorn's shuttle docked with the flagship, a massive vessel named the Anvil of Necessity. The name was a typical piece of human literalism that would have made a Keth poet weep with frustration. As he stepped onto the bridge, the air was thick with the sound of barking orders and the rhythmic clatter of mechanical keyboards. There was no music here, only the white noise of a machine at war. The commander of the fleet, a woman whose face was a map of deep space radiation burns, didn't look up from her tactical display. She merely asked if the talk was over. Thorn nodded, taking his seat at the strategic console. He told her that the Keth thought they were conducting a symphony. The commander grunted, a short, sharp sound of amusement, and replied that it was time to show them that some audiences don't like the tune. She gave the signal, and the human fleet began its first countervolley. It wasn't a beam of light or a pulse of energy. It was a swarm of solid tungsten slugs, accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light by electromagnetic rails. It was primitive, it was loud, and it was devastatingly effective against ships made of solidified light. The Keth were caught off guard by the sheer physicality of the attack. Their shields, designed to refract and dissipate energy, were ill-equipped to handle the kinetic energy of a multi-ton mass of metal. The first slug punched through a Keth cruiser, entering through the bow and exiting through the stern, leaving a jagged, venting hole that ruined the ship's structural integrity. The beautiful, glowing hull flickered and died, the light stitch failing as the vacuum claimed the atmosphere within. There was no grace in the death of the ship. It was a violent, messy collapse. The Keth reacted with shock, their formations breaking as they tried to adjust to this new, barbaric form of warfare. They had forgotten that space was not just an empty void to be decorated. It was a place of immense distances and terrifying momentum. They had forgotten the power of a simple, heavy object moving very, very fast. Thorn watched the tactical display, seeing the bright icons of the Keth ships flicker and vanish, replaced by the dull, persistent markers of the human fleet. He knew this was only the beginning, that the Keth would adapt, but for now the iron was holding. By the end of the first day of the conflict, the space around Ferrum Prime was littered with debris. The Keth had lost a dozen of their most beautiful vessels, their wreckage drifting like shattered glass in the dark. The humans had lost 3 of their hulks, but even in death, the human ships remained dangerous, their thick plating providing cover for the remaining fleet. The Keth were beginning to realize that they weren't fighting a war of ideas or aesthetics. They were fighting a war of attrition against a species that was perfectly comfortable living in the ruins of their own civilization. Thorn felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The Keth had wanted to teach the humans a lesson about the sanctity of the universe, but instead, the humans were teaching the Keth a lesson about the reality of the universe. The reality was that beauty is fragile, but a block of iron is forever. As he prepared for the next wave of the assault, Thorn looked at the readings from the planet below. The bunkers were sealed, the atmosphere was scrubbed, and the people of Ferrum Prime were waiting in the dark, ready to endure whatever the Keth could throw at them. The iron was hot, and the forging had begun. The second phase of the conflict began not with a flash of brilliance, but with the steady, rhythmic thrum of heavy machinery vibrating through the tectonic plates of Ferrum Prime. Deep beneath the surface, the human population had transitioned from a mining colony into a subterranean organism designed for survival. The Keth, frustrated by the stubborn refusal of the human fleet to break, shifted their tactical focus to the planetoid itself. They believed that by targeting the civilian heart of the occupation, they could force a psychological collapse. They did not understand that for a human, the distinction between civilian and soldier blurred into insignificance when the walls began to shake. The Keth High Command ordered the deployment of their resonance cannons, weapons that did not rely on heat or kinetic impact, but on the manipulation of gravitational waves to shatter solid matter into its constituent atoms. They aimed these beams at the primary ventilation shafts, intending to collapse the lungs of the colony and suffocate the inhabitants in a tomb of their own making. On the bridge of the anvil of necessity, the tactical displays were a chaotic web of sensor ghosts and energy signatures. The commander watched as the Keth fleet repositioned itself into a massive, shimmering ring around the planetoid, a halo of impending destruction. She knew the humans couldn't stop the resonance beams from firing. The physics of the Keth weaponry outpaced their own defensive capabilities by centuries. Instead, she ordered the fleet to dive. Rather than staying in the high orbit where they were vulnerable to long-range sniping, the human ships descended into the upper atmosphere of Ferrum Prime, using the planet's own gravity well as a tether and its thick, metallic clouds as a shroud. It was a reckless maneuver that put immense strain on the hulls of the ships, the metal screaming as it fought against the drag of the gas. The Keth hesitated, their sophisticated targeting systems struggling to lock onto targets that were actively dragging themselves through a soup of iron dust and sulfur. Inside the bunkers, the sound of the resonance beams hitting the crust was like the groaning of a dying god. It wasn't an explosion. It was a deep, soul-shuddering vibration that turned the very air into a weapon. The human engineers, led by a man named Marrows who had spent 40 years digging tunnels in the belt, didn't panic. They had built the bunkers with a philosophy of redundancy. Every time a tunnel collapsed, 3 more took its place. Every time a power line was severed, a backup chemical battery kicked in. They had reinforced the ceilings with layers of lead, rubber, and pressurized liquid that absorbed the kinetic energy of the vibrations. Marrows stood in the center of the primary command hub, his hands coated in the fine, gray dust of the world, watching the structural integrity monitors. He saw the red zones spreading across the map, sections of the upper levels being pulverized into powder, yet he remained calm. He knew that the Keth were treating the planet like a delicate sculpture they were trying to break, while he was treating it like a shield he was trying to thicken. Thorn, now acting as a liaison between the orbiting fleet and the surface, monitored the communications from a reinforced bunker near the planetary core. He could hear the muffled roar of the Keth beams overhead, a constant, low-frequency hum that made his teeth ache. The Keth were pouring an incredible amount of energy into the bombardment, enough to power a small star system for a year, yet the humans were still breathing. This was the fundamental error of the Keth. They overestimated the efficiency of destruction. They believed that if you applied enough force to a point, the whole structure would give way. They didn't account for the human tendency to absorb the damage and integrate it into the defense. The rubble from the collapsed upper levels was being packed down by the sheer force of the beams, creating a new, denser layer of armor that the subsequent shots had an even harder time penetrating. The Keth were effectively forging a stronger shield for their enemies with every shot they fired. The Keth High Arbiter, watching the progress from the safety of the station, was beginning to experience a sensation that his species had largely forgotten: doubt. The sensors showed that 30% of the planetoid's crust had been liquefied or pulverized, yet the life signs in the deep mantle remained steady. The humans were not crying out for mercy. They were silent, burrowing deeper like a virus that refused to be purged. The Arbiter ordered the fleet to increase the intensity, to push the resonance cannons to their thermal limits. The glowing needles of the Keth ships grew even brighter, their hulls shimmering with the heat of the energy they were channeling. In doing so, they became beacons in the dark, their positions highlighted against the blackness of space. This was the opening the human fleet had been waiting for. From the thick clouds of Ferrum Prime, the anvil of necessity and its sister ships rose like leviathans from a dark sea, their railguns already humming with stored potential. The human counterattack was not a surgical strike, it was a broadside. They didn't aim for the Keth ship's vital systems, they aimed for the massive energy collectors that were feeding the resonance cannons. The tungsten slugs, heavy and indifferent to the Keth's light-based shields, tore through the delicate arrays. When a railgun slug hits a high-energy capacitor, the result is not a clean puncture, but a catastrophic release of stored power. 3 Keth destroyers vanished in a chain reaction of blue-white fire, their elegant frames twisting into blackened husks before they were consumed by the vacuum. The ring formation broke as the survivors scrambled to adjust their shields, but the humans didn't give them the chance. They stayed close, weaving through the debris of the destroyed ships, using the Keth's own wreckage as cover. It was a knife fight in a dark room, and the humans had the heavier blade. As the battle raged in orbit, the conditions on the surface became almost unbearable. The heat from the resonance beams had seeped through the rock, turning the bunkers into ovens. The humans stripped down to their basic undergarments, their skin glistening with sweat as they worked to keep the air scrubbers running. There was no conversation, no wasted breath. They communicated through hand signals and short, barked commands. They were a collective of labor, a singular will focused on the act of not dying. This was the human heritage that the Keth had failed to recognize, the ability to turn suffering into a process. To the Keth, pain was a signal to stop, to rethink, to retreat. To the humans on Ferrum Prime, pain was simply the cost of doing business. It was a variable to be managed, not a deterrent. Marrows watched as a section of the hub's ceiling cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across the reinforced concrete. He didn't move. He simply ordered the secondary support pillars to be pressurized. Thorn sent a message to the fleet, a simple string of coordinates and a single word: pressure. He knew that the Keth were reaching their breaking point, not because they were losing the military engagement, but because their logic was failing them. They were a species of poets and architects who found themselves locked in a room with a species of blacksmiths. The blacksmiths didn't care if the room was beautiful, they only cared if the walls held. The Keth were losing their composure, their movements becoming erratic as they tried to reconcile their perceived superiority with the reality of their losses. They began to fire wildly, their beams missing the human ships and striking the planetoid's surface in random patterns, further destabilizing the crust, but doing little to damage the deep-seated bunkers. The Keth fleet, once a masterpiece of coordination, was becoming a panicked flock. The High Arbiter, seeing his fleet falter, made a desperate decision. He ordered the flagship of the Keth fleet, the luminous Sovereign, to descend into the atmosphere and engage the human flagship directly. It was a move born of pride, a desire to prove that the Keth's light could still overcome the human's iron. The Sovereign was a massive vessel, a cathedral of glass and magnetic fields, and as it entered the clouds of Ferrum Prime, it looked like a falling star. The human commander saw it coming and didn't flinch. She ordered the Anvil of Necessity to meet the Keth flagship head-on. The two massive ships closed the distance, their hulls glowing with the friction of the descent. The Keth fired everything they had, lasers, plasma bolts, resonance pulses, but the Anvil was built like a brick. It took the hits on its nose, the thick slabs of lead and steel melting and sloughing off, but the ship kept moving forward, its momentum unstoppable. The collision was not a clean impact. The Anvil of Necessity didn't try to dodge. It rammed the luminous Sovereign with the full force of its engines. The human ship's prow, a solid block of reinforced tungsten, punched through the Keth ship's magnetic shields and buried itself deep in the delicate interior of the vessel. The Sovereign buckled, its beautiful light-stitch frame snapping like dry twigs. For a moment, the two ships were locked together, a twisted mass of grey metal and glowing glass falling through the sulphurous clouds. On the bridge of the Anvil, the human crew was thrown from their stations by the impact, but they scrambled back to their feet, their faces bloody, but their eyes fixed on their monitors. They began to fire their short-range point defense cannons directly into the internal structure of the Keth ship, tearing it apart from the inside. Inside the Sovereign, the Keth were in a state of total horror. Their world was ending not with a whisper, but with the sound of grinding metal and the roar of human engines. They saw the human soldiers boarding through the breach, not in sleek-powered armor, but in heavy, bulky vacuum suits, carrying industrial cutting torches and kinetic shotguns. These were not the warriors the Keth had imagined. These were workers who had been given weapons, and they fought with the same grim efficiency with which they mined asteroids. They moved through the elegant halls of the Keth ship like a blight, clearing rooms with bursts of buckshot and high-explosive charges. The Keth, whose weapons were designed for long-range elegance, found themselves defenseless in the cramped, smoke-filled corridors of their own home. The High Arbiter watched from the station as his flagship was consumed. He saw the Anvil of Necessity break away from the wreckage, its nose mangled and its hull scarred, but still functional, still firing. The Sovereign began to spiral downward, its anti-gravity drives failing until it disappeared into the thick, glowing clouds of the planetoid. A few seconds later, a massive shockwave rippled through the atmosphere, a dull orange glow illuminating the clouds from below as the Keth flagship struck the surface. The Arbiter felt a coldness settle in his chest, a realization that the humans had not just survived the bombardment, they had used it to lure his most valuable assets into a trap. The battle for the orbit was over. The Keth fleet, what was left of it, began to pull back, retreating to the safety of the outer system to regroup and lick their wounds. On the surface of Ferrum Prime, the humans felt the impact of the Sovereign. The shockwave was massive, but the bunkers held. In the command hub, Marrows looked at the monitors and saw the Keth signatures fading from the local space. He allowed himself a small, weary smile. He turned to his team and told them to start the pumps. They had a lot of dust to clear. Thorn, emerging from the depths, walked out onto a viewing platform that had somehow survived the bombardment. He looked out over the landscape. The surface of the planetoid was unrecognizable, a jagged wasteland of fused glass and cooling magma. But sticking out of the wreckage, like the bones of a giant, were the reinforced entrance pylons of the human bunkers. They were scorched, pitted, and ugly, but they were still standing. The Keth had tried to rewrite the geometry of the world, but the iron had refused to bend. Thorn knew that the Keth would be back. They were a proud species, and they would not take this defeat lightly. They would bring more ships, more powerful weapons, and a more focused hatred. But he also knew that every hour the Keth spent regrouping was an hour the humans spent digging. They would turn the wreckage of the Sovereign into new armor. They would mine the moonlets for more tungsten. They would continue to do what they did best. They would endure. As the red giant sun rose over the scarred horizon, casting a long shadow from the human flagship above, Thorn felt a sense of grim pride. The Keth lived in a universe of light and shadow, of beauty and grace. The humans lived in a universe of weight and friction. And in a world where everything eventually breaks, the one who can hold their pieces together the longest is the one who wins. The retreat of the Keth fleet to the outer reaches of the system provided a temporary reprieve, but it did not bring peace. Instead, it inaugurated a period of frantic, industrial desperation that the humans referred to as the Great Scavenge. The surface of Ferrum Prime was no longer a planetary crust in the traditional sense. It was a chaotic conglomerate of fused silicate, cooling radiation, and the mangled remains of Keth technology. On the bridge of the Anvil of Necessity, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of scorched insulation and the metallic tang of recycled air. The flagship was a wounded animal, its forward sensor arrays shattered and its hull integrity down to 40%. Yet, the commander did not order a retreat to the nearest deep space shipyard. She knew that the Keth would be monitoring the gravity wells, waiting to intercept any vessel attempting to limp back to the safety of the inner human colonies. Survival would not be found in flight, but in the radical repurposing of the debris that now orbited the planetoid like a shroud of junk. Thorn coordinated the efforts between the orbiting hulks and the subterranean workers. The Keth had left behind more than just wreckage. They had left behind exotic materials that the human engineers had only ever seen in theoretical physics papers. The light-stitch hulls of the Keth destroyers, while fragile under kinetic impact, possessed a structural memory and energy conduction efficiency that was light-years ahead of human copper and fiber optics. Under the direction of Marrows, human salvage teams in bulky, lead-lined suits ventured into the graveyard of ships. They didn't use delicate instruments to dismantle the Keth remains. They used plasma cutters and hydraulic shears. They stripped the iridescent panels from the luminous Sovereign and dragged them back to the bunkers, where they were melted down and integrated into the human power grid. It was an act of technological cannibalism, a crude species forcing the refined tools of a more advanced civilization to serve a more primitive master. The Keth, watching from their distant observation posts, were horrified by the telemetry they received. To them, the ruins of their ships were sacred, the final resting places of their honored dead, and the masterpieces of their greatest architects. To see the humans hacking apart the remains of the Sovereign to patch the holes in their own rusted hulls was a psychic blow more profound than the loss of the battle itself. The High Arbiter, his crest now permanently flattened in a gesture of profound mourning and rage, could not comprehend the lack of reverence. He viewed the humans as a fungal infection, something that did not just destroy its host, but consumed its essence to fuel its own growth. He ordered the Keth research divisions to bypass the standard safety protocols for their next generation of weapons. If the humans were comfortable with the ugly and the crude, the Keth would provide them with a form of destruction so absolute that there would be nothing left to scavenge. Back on Ferrum Prime, the transition was becoming visible in the very architecture of the colony. The once uniform gray of the human bunkers was now patched with the shimmering, multicolored alloys of the Keth. The internal power conduits glowed with a soft, pulsing violet light, the result of human technicians jury-rigging Keth energy crystals into their ancient generators. The output was erratic and dangerous. 3 technicians had already been vaporized when a crystal destabilized, but the result was an exponential increase in the colony's defensive capabilities. The humans were learning to speak the language of the Keth, not through linguistics, but through the universal medium of engineering. They were discovering that the Keth technology relied on a harmonic frequency that could be disrupted if you knew the right tone. They weren't just rebuilding, they were evolving, turning their isolation into a laboratory of necessity. The psychological toll on the human population was immense. Living in a world of constant vibration and recycled oxygen, with the threat of annihilation hanging overhead, had stripped away the last vestiges of civilian life. Every man, woman, and child was now a cog in a massive machine of preservation. They slept in shifts on the cold floors of the factories, their dreams filled with the sound of grinding metal. There was no art, no leisure, and no recreation. The only culture that remained was the culture of the fix. A person's worth was measured by their ability to keep a machine running or to find a way to make a broken part work for one more day. Thorne watched as the social fabric of the colony tightened into a singular, grim resolve. He realized that the Keth had made a fatal mistake. By stripping away the humans' comforts, they had removed the only things that made the humans prone to compromise. In the second week of the scavenge, the human fleet detected a massive energy spike from the system's Uit cloud. The Keth were no longer sending ships. They were sending a singular, massive projectile. It was a relativistic kill vehicle, a slug of hyperdense matter accelerated to 99% of the speed of light. It didn't have a pilot, a crew, or a weapon system. It was simply mass and velocity, a physical manifestation of the Keth's newfound understanding of human warfare. The Arbiter had decided that if the humans wanted to fight with kinetic energy, the Keth would provide a kinetic event that would turn Ferrum Prime into a second sun. The projectile was too small to be intercepted by railguns and moving too fast for traditional targeting. It would strike the planetoid in less than 6 hours, and the impact would be equivalent to a multi-teraton explosion. The news of the incoming projectile reached the anvil of necessity with a cold finality. The commander looked at the trajectory and realized that no amount of lead or concrete could save them from a direct hit. The atmosphere on the bridge, usually a cacophony of activity, fell into a heavy, expectant stillness. There were no grand speeches, no tears. There was only the sound of data being processed. Thorne, speaking from the bunker, proposed a solution that bordered on the suicidal. He pointed out that the Keth's own light-stitch technology, which they had been scavenging, was designed to manipulate gravitational fields on a localized level. If they could synchronize the Keth crystals they had installed across the planetoid and the fleet, they might be able to create a momentary gravitational shear, a localized dip in space-time that would deflect the projectile just enough to miss the core of the world. The plan required a level of coordination that was theoretically impossible. The human computers weren't fast enough to handle the calculations, and the Keth crystals were prone to exploding when pushed to their limits. It required the human operators to manually balance the energy flow, using their own intuition and the feedback from the machines to maintain the harmonic. Marrows and his engineers began the work immediately, crawling into the narrow, radiation-filled access tunnels where the crystals were housed. They didn't have shielding. They used their own bodies as barriers, knowing that the exposure would be fatal within minutes. They were the last line of defense, a group of tired, dirty humans trying to outmaneuver the laws of physics with a handful of stolen glass. As the projectile entered the inner system, it appeared on the human sensors as a streak of pure white light, a needle of doom cutting through the darkness. The Keth watched with a sense of grim satisfaction, their sensors tuned to record the moment the human infestation was finally burned away. On Ferrum Prime, the order was given to initiate the harmonic. Across the planetoid, the Keth crystals began to glow with a blinding, terrifying intensity. The human operators held their positions, their hands on the controls as the heat began to blister their skin. They could feel the energy humming through their bones, a vibration that threatened to tear their molecules apart. In orbit, the anvil of necessity and the remaining ships aligned themselves, their own scavenged arrays pulsing in perfect, desperate synchronization with the surface. The moment of impact was not a sound, but a distortion of reality. As the relativistic slug reached the edge of Ferrum Prime's gravity well, the combined energy of the crystals flared into a singular, localized ripple. The projectile, instead of punching through the crust, caught the edge of the gravitational shear. For a fraction of a second, the laws of inertia were suspended. The slug groaned as it was forced into a new trajectory, the sheer friction of the spacetime distortion stripping away its outer layers and turning it into a comet of molten star matter. It missed the center of the planetoid by less than 100 miles, skimming through the upper atmosphere. The shockwave was enough to strip the remaining clouds from the world and level every surface pylon, but the core, the heart of the colony, remained intact. The projectile continued into the void, a spent bullet that eventually struck the red giant sun, causing a solar flare that illuminated the entire system in a sickly, vengeful crimson. On Ferrum Prime, the silence that followed was absolute. The crystals had shattered, their energy spent, and the human operators who had held the harmonic were dead, their bodies turned to ash by the sheer power they had channeled. Maros stood in the darkness of the command hub, his eyes burning and his lungs heavy with the scent of ozone. He looked at the monitors and saw that they were still there. The world was still there. They had survived the impossible not because they were stronger, but because they were willing to pay a price the Keth could not even imagine. In the aftermath, the Keth High Arbiter did not order another strike. He sat in his darkened chamber on the station, watching the footage of the deflection over and over again. He saw the humans sacrifice their own people to save a rock. He saw them use his own technology to defy the very principles of his civilization. For the first time in the history of the Keth, the Arbiter felt a sensation that was not pride, not rage, but a deep, primal fear. He realized that the humans were not just a species, they were a force of nature. They were the entropy of the universe given a voice and a will. He understood then that the war would not end with a human surrender. It would only end when there was nothing left of either side but the cold, unyielding iron. He began to draft the orders for a total withdrawal from the sector, not because the Keth were defeated, but because they were terrified of what the humans would become if the forging continued. Thorn stood on the mangled deck of the Anvil of Necessity, looking down at the scarred, glowing marble of Ferrum Prime. He knew the Keth were leaving. He could see their ships jumping into warp, their lights fading into the background of stars. He didn't feel a sense of victory. He felt the weight of the loss, the cost of the endurance. He knew that the humans who remained were no longer the people who had arrived in this system. They had been changed by the friction, hardened by the heat, and tempered by the loss. They were a new kind of humanity, one that had looked into the maw of a superior civilization and refused to blink. As he watched the last of the Keth signatures vanish, Thorn realized that the galaxy was a very large place, and there were many more things out there that would try to break them. He turned back to the bridge and gave the only order that mattered: start the repairs. The departure of the Keth fleet did not signal the arrival of a golden age for the survivors of Ferrum Prime. Instead, it ushered in a period of cold, calculated reconstruction that favored the mechanical over the biological. The planetoid was no longer a mining colony, nor was it a simple military outpost. It had become a hybrid entity, a jagged sphere of human steel interlaced with the semi-organic, light-conductive filaments of Keth wreckage. The atmosphere had been almost entirely stripped away by the passage of the relativistic projectile, leaving the surface exposed to the unfiltered radiation of the red giant. The humans did not attempt to terraform the world back to its original state. They accepted the vacuum as their new neighbor. They built massive glass domes using the fused silicate of the bombardment, creating pressurized bubbles where the air was thick, humid, and smelled perpetually of scorched copper. Inside these domes, the survivors moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, their lives dictated by the maintenance cycles of the air scrubbers and the energy output of the scavenged Keth cores. Thorn, whose neural implant now crackled with the interference of the planet's heightened electromagnetic field, spent his days in the deep core archives. He was no longer just a representative. He was the archivist of a new human era. He documented the names of those who had held the harmonic, the engineers who had turned their own nervous systems into conduits for the Keth crystals. He realized that the human memory was becoming as reinforced as their bunkers. They did not mourn the dead with songs or poetry. They honored them by ensuring that the machines they died to protect never stopped running. This was an evolution of the human spirit that troubled Thorne in his quieter moments. The empathy that had once defined their species was being replaced by a terrifyingly efficient logic of preservation. They were becoming as hard and unyielding as the iron they pulled from the crust, a transformation that was necessary for survival but costly to the soul. Marrows, the lead engineer who had survived the thermal pulse of the defense, was now a man of more metal than flesh. His left arm had been replaced by a heavy-duty industrial manipulator, and his eyes were shielded by permanent ocular implants that allowed him to see the flow of energy through the Keth-human hybrid grid. He oversaw the construction of the Great Ring, a massive orbital structure built from the carcasses of the Keth destroyers. The ring was designed to be a permanent shield and a shipyard, a place where the human fleet could be rebuilt not as clumsy hulks, but as something new. They were integrating Keth light-stitch technology into the frames of their ships, creating vessels that possessed the durability of human steel and the speed of Keth light manipulation. These were not ships of war in the traditional sense. They were tools of expansion designed to ensure that no other species would ever again mistake human endurance for weakness. The Keth, meanwhile, had retreated to their home systems, but they had not forgotten the lesson of Ferrum Prime. They observed the human activity from the safety of long-range sensor buoys, watching as the fungal infection they had tried to purge began to build something that defied their understanding of progress. The Keth civilization was built on the idea of the perfect form, a belief that technology should be an extension of the natural beauty of the universe. The humans were building a functional abomination, a chaotic mess of wires, plates, and crystals that prioritized survival over symmetry. To the Keth, the human expansion was a cosmic horror story, a species that refused to die even when the laws of physics demanded it. They began to build a diplomatic wall around the sector, warning other advanced species to avoid the humans at all costs, describing them as a kinetic contagion that thrived on conflict and scarcity. Inside the human domes, a new generation was being born. These children did not know the blue skies of Earth or the soft winds of the inner colonies. They were raised in the red glow of the giant sun, their playgrounds the decommissioned corridors of Keth cruisers. They spoke a dialect that was a mix of technical jargon and the blunt, truncated English of the miners. They were stronger than their ancestors, their bone density increased by the high-gravity training required to work on the Great Ring, and their minds were attuned to the constant hum of the machinery. They did not fear the dark of space. They viewed it as a resource to be harvested. Thorne watched these children and felt a pang of ancient sorrow. They were the first true citizens of the void, a branch of humanity that had finally shed the need for a planetary womb. They were the heirs to the iron, and they looked at the stars not with wonder, but with a calculating eye for mineral content and strategic value. The first of the new ships, the vanguard of the unrefined, was launched from the Great Ring in the 3rd year after the bombardment. It was a terrifying sight. Its hull was a patchwork of matte black lead plates and shimmering Keth light panels that flickered like a dying strobe. It didn't move with the grace of a Keth vessel. It moved with a series of violent, localized gravity shifts that made the space around it warp and scream. It was a ship built by people who had survived the end of their world and decided to bring that end to anyone who got in their way. As the Vanguard cleared the orbital plane, its engines ignited with a roar that could be felt through the station's floor. It wasn't just a ship, it was a statement of intent. Humanity was no longer content to burrow into the dark. They were going to own the dark, one asteroid at a time. The commander of the Anvil of Necessity, her face now a mask of scar tissue and synthetic grafts, took command of the vanguard. She didn't give a speech to the crew. She simply opened a channel to every human habitat in the sector and told them that the iron was forged and the cooling was over. She set a course for the nearest Keth listening post, not to attack it, but to park the vanguard directly in its sensor range. She wanted the Keth to see what they had created. She wanted them to look at the ship and see the reflection of their own failure. The listening post, manned by a terrified Keth crew, immediately sent a distress signal, but no Keth fleet arrived to assist. They had learned their lesson. They watched as the human ship sat there, silent and immovable, a monolith of defiance that blocked out the light of the stars. The diplomatic isolation imposed by the Keth backfired. Instead of starving the humans of resources, it forced them to become entirely self-sufficient. They developed methods of deep mantle mining that turned the core of Ferrum Prime into a factory of unprecedented scale. They learned to synthesize the Keth crystals in massive pressure chambers, creating energy sources that were more stable and powerful than the originals. The humans were no longer scavengers, they were innovators of the brutal. They developed kinetic weapons that used gravitational lensing to curve slugs around planetary bodies, and they built shielding that could absorb and redirect energy attacks into their own batteries. They were becoming a military powerhouse fueled by the very vacuum that was supposed to have killed them. Thorne realized that the humans were no longer just a species, they were becoming a phenomenon. In the archives, he began to write the Treatise on Friction, a document that outlined the human philosophy of growth through resistance. He argued that the Keth and other enlightened species had plateaued because they had eliminated friction from their lives. They lived in a world of smooth surfaces and easy energy. Humans, by contrast, had been defined by the struggle against the grain. Every advancement they made was the result of a collision between their will and a hostile environment. Ferrum Prime was the ultimate collision, and the result was a hardness that the galaxy was not prepared to handle. He sent this treatise out on an unencrypted broadcast, a gift of knowledge to any species that was brave enough to read it. As the Vanguard returned from its patrol, it brought with it a series of automated drones it had captured from the Keth borders. These drones were filled with data, maps of the surrounding sectors, and details on the trade routes of the various alien factions. The human leadership did not look at these maps with an eye for trade or cooperation. They looked for the choke points, the resource-rich belts, and the systems that could be turned into fortresses. They were planning the next phase of their existence, an expansion that would be slow, steady, and entirely unstoppable. They were not looking for an empire of light, they were looking for a domain of iron. The commander looked at the maps and noted that there were hundreds of systems like Ferrum Prime, worlds that the advanced species had ignored because they were too harsh or too ugly. To the humans, these were the perfect foundations for a new kind of civilization. The chapter of survival was closing, and the chapter of dominance was beginning. The people of Ferrum Prime began to migrate into the new ships, leaving the domes of the planetoid behind. They didn't leave because the world was failing, but because they had outgrown it. They had become a nomadic species of industrial warriors, their homes the very vessels that protected them. Thorne stood on the final shuttle, looking back at the scarred surface of the world that had nearly been their tomb. He saw the Great Ring, a halo of human industry encircling the rock, and he felt a strange sense of peace. The iron had been refined, the impurities burned away by the Keth fire. What remained was something pure, something cold, and something that would never, ever break. He boarded the shuttle and felt the familiar, comforting vibration of the engines through his boots. The journey was just beginning. The transition from the fortified silence of Ferrum Prime to the calculated expansion into the neighboring systems was marked by a shift in human psychology that the Keth had failed to anticipate. While the avian species expected the humans to strike back in a fit of vengeful rage, the survivors of the bombardment instead moved with the cold, methodical grace of a glacier. They did not seek to burn the Keth worlds, they sought to occupy the spaces between them. The human fleet, now a collection of vessels that looked more like mobile refineries than warships, began to settle in the gravity wells of dead stars and the chaotic orbits of gas giants. They sought out environments that were hostile to biological life, places where the radiation was thick enough to scramble the delicate sensors of the Keth, and where the pressures were high enough to crush any ship not reinforced with the human-Keth hybrid alloys. This was the era of the Iron Nebula, a period where humanity redefined the concept of territory from a collection of habitable planets to a network of strategic strongholds. Thorne, now a senior strategist aboard the orbital command hub known as the Crucible of Intent, watched the telemetry from the first forward operating base in the Noxus system. Noxus was a place of eternal twilight, a binary system where a white dwarf was slowly devouring its companion star, creating a swirling disk of superheated gas and lethal X-rays. To any other species, it was a navigational hazard to be avoided at all costs. To the humans, it was a fortress. The high-energy environment provided a near-infinite source of power for their scavenged crystals, and the thick curtains of ionized gas provided perfect concealment for their growing shipyards. Marrows had overseen the construction of the Noxus siphon, a massive structure that dipped into the accretion disk to harvest heavy elements directly from the star's dying breath. It was an engineering feat that bordered on the insane, requiring the ships to maintain a constant, high-output shield to prevent their hulls from vaporizing, but the humans did not care about the risk. They cared about the output. The Keth response to this encroachment was one of paralyzed observation. They could not engage the humans in these environments. Their ships, built for the elegant navigation of clear space, would have their light-stitch hulls shredded by the micrometeors and radiation of the Noxus system. The High Arbiter, now an aging figure whose influence was waning in the face of the human threat, watched the human expansion as a slow-motion catastrophe. He realized that the humans were not just surviving, they were terraforming themselves to fit the cracks in the universe. They were becoming a species that did not need the light. Every time a Keth patrol ventured near the edge of a human-occupied nebula, they were met not with a challenge, but with the silent, overwhelming presence of a human hulk sitting motionless in the dark. The humans never fired first, but the sheer mass of their ships and the intensity of their sensor sweeps were a warning that the era of Keth dominance was over. On the Crucible of Intent, the social structure of humanity had fully calcified into a technocratic meritocracy. There was no longer any distinction between civilian and military authority. There was only the efficiency of the machine. Decisions were made based on the calculus of resources and the long-term sustainability of the fleet. Thorne found himself increasingly at odds with the younger generation of leaders who viewed the history of Earth as a sentimental distraction. To them, the struggle on Ferrum Prime was the beginning of time, and the Keth were not a rival species, but a biological error to be corrected. This hardening of the human heart was the friction Thorne had written about, but he had not expected the heat to be so cold. He saw children who could calculate orbital mechanics in their heads, but could not describe the color of a sunset they had never seen. They were the children of the vacuum, and their ambition was as vast and empty as the space they inhabited. The first major confrontation of the expansion occurred when a human mining group discovered a massive deposit of iridium on a moonlet orbiting a Keth-protected garden world. The Keth had left the moonlet untouched, viewing it as a natural part of the planet's aesthetic balance. The humans, seeing only the raw material needed for their reactor casings, landed a fleet of harvesters and began to strip the moonlet to its core. The Keth local governor, desperate to maintain some semblance of authority, dispatched a squadron of interceptors to demand the humans cease their operations. The human response was a simple, automated broadcast. The matter is being repurposed for the preservation of the collective. Interference will be viewed as a kinetic challenge. When the Keth opened fire with their low-intensity lasers, the human harvesters didn't even stop. They simply turned their mining lasers, designed to crack open planetary crusts, toward the Keth ships. The resulting destruction was instantaneous and total. The news of the skirmish sent shockwaves through the Keth High Command. It was the first time the humans had used their industrial tools as weapons of war, and the efficiency was terrifying. It wasn't just that the humans had won. It was that they had done so without even diverting from their primary task. The mining of the moonlet continued even as the Keth wreckage drifted into the planet's atmosphere, burning up like falling stars. The Keth realized that the humans were no longer interested in diplomacy or reparations. They were interested in mass. They were consuming the galaxy to build more of themselves, and they were doing it with an indifference that was more frightening than any hatred. The Arbiter attempted to reach out to Thorn, sending a message through an old, encrypted channel, pleading for a return to the geometry of peace. Thorn's reply was a single image, a map of the sector with the human-occupied zones marked in the dull, unyielding gray of iron. As the humans consolidated their hold on the Iron Nebula, they began to experiment with the final piece of the Keth technology, the synchronization of consciousness. The Keth used it for art and communal worship, but the humans saw a different potential. They began to link the minds of their engineers and pilots through the neural implants, creating a hive mind focused entirely on the logistics of the fleet. This was the ultimate evolution of the human machine. On the Crucible, Thorn watched as a team of 500 workers moved in perfect unison, their thoughts woven together by the hum of the Keth crystals. They were no longer individuals. They were a singular processing unit. This allowed them to manage the complexities of the Noxus siphon and the construction of the Great Ring with an accuracy that exceeded any computer. But it also meant that the individual human voice was being drowned out by the roar of the collective will. Thorn realized that the humans were losing the very thing that had allowed them to survive, their unpredictability. By becoming a machine, they were becoming a system that could eventually be solved. He began to secret away a library of human literature and history, physical books, and handwritten journals that could not be digitized or integrated into the neural grid. He called it the memory of the unrefined, a record of the messiness and the failure that had once defined their species. He knew that the younger leaders would view this as a waste of resources, but he hoped that one day, when the expansion slowed and the iron began to rust, someone would need to remember why they had started this journey in the first place. He saw himself as the last piece of grit in a perfectly smooth gear, a necessary friction that kept the machine from spinning out of control. The chapter reached its climax when the Keth, in a final act of desperation, attempted to collapse the white dwarf in the Noxus system, hoping to create a supernova that would wipe out the human fleet and the Iron Nebula in one stroke. They used a series of resonance probes, the same technology they had used on Ferrum Prime, to destabilize the star's core. The humans detected the spike in energy and realized what was happening. Rather than fleeing, the collective mind of the Noxus fleet turned its entire focus toward the star. They didn't try to stop the probes. They used their mining lasers and gravity wells to redirect the energy of the collapsing star into their own collectors. They turned a supernova into a fuel source. The white dwarf did not explode. It was drained, its lifeblood sucked out by the human siphon until it became a cold, dark cinder. The failure of the star collapse was the final nail in the coffin of Keth pride. They had tried to use the power of the heavens to destroy a species of miners, and the miners had simply put the heavens to work. The High Arbiter resigned, his species retreating into their inner worlds and shutting down their warp gates, hoping that by making themselves invisible, the humans would pass them by. The humans didn't care. They were already looking past the Keth, toward the deeper reaches of the galaxy where the resources were even more abundant and the environment even more hostile. They were the lords of the Iron Nebula, a civilization of cold logic and heavy matter, moving forward with the crushing weight of an avalanche. Thorn, standing on the observation deck of the Crucible, looked out at the dead star and felt the silence of a species that had finally conquered the dark, but had forgotten how to live in the light. The expansion was no longer a struggle for survival. It was a process of universal reorganization. The humans were the new architects, but they did not build with light and shadow. They built with the weight of unrefined iron and the calculus of the unbroken. As the fleet prepared for the next jump, Thorn felt the vibration of the engines through his feet, a constant, rhythmic reminder of the friction that had brought them here. He knew that the galaxy was changing, that the era of elegance was over, and the era of the machine had begun. He wondered, as the stars blurred into streaks of grey, if there was anything left in the universe that could still make a human heart skip a beat, or if they had finally succeeded in refining the soul out of the iron. The final expansion of the human collective did not culminate in a grand galactic war, for there was no one left who possessed the stomach to challenge the relentless logic of the Iron Nebula. The Keth had faded into a tertiary power, their beautiful light-stitched cities becoming museum pieces, while the humans turned the surrounding systems into a vast, interconnected industrial heartland. The Crucible of Intent had grown into a station the size of a small moon, a sprawling lattice of steel and scavenged crystal that served as the neural hub for a species that now spanned 100 systems. Humanity had achieved what no other civilization in the quadrant had managed. They had reached a state of perfect, unyielding equilibrium with the vacuum. They no longer fought against the universe. They had become its most efficient expression. Yet, as the last of the Keth border worlds were integrated into the human logistics grid, a strange and quiet crisis began to emerge from the very center of the collective. Thorn, now a man of extreme age whose life was sustained by a complex web of biomechanical life support, sat in the silent heart of the memory of the unrefined. His library was a relic, a pocket of stillness in a civilization that never stopped humming. He observed the data streams coming from the younger generation, those who were now more machine than man, and he saw a terrifying trend. The efficiency of the collective had reached such a peak that innovation had begun to stall. Without the friction of loss, without the threat of extinction, the humans were beginning to repeat the very mistake the Keth had made centuries prior. They were perfecting their form, but they were losing their impetus. The iron had been refined to such a degree that it had become brittle. They were a civilization of masters, with nothing left to learn and nowhere left to dig. Marrows, the architect of the Iron Nebula, came to see Thorn one final time. Marrows was now almost entirely encased in a life support suit of polished tungsten, his voice a synthesized rasp that echoed through the library. He spoke of the Great Ring, which now encircled the entire Noxus system, and of the ships that were being built to cross the intergalactic void. He spoke of the triumph of human engineering, but his sensors, tuned to the most minute vibrations of the station, could not detect the one thing he was looking for, a reason to continue. The collective mind was beginning to experience a form of existential stagnation. In their quest to eliminate weakness and inefficiency, they had inadvertently eliminated the desire for anything other than more of the same. The humans had become a closed loop, a perfect machine that was slowly running out of purpose. Thorn looked at his old friend and realized that the final act of human endurance would not be surviving a bombardment or a supernova. It would be surviving themselves. He proposed a radical solution, one that the collective mind initially rejected as a catastrophic waste of resources. He suggested that the humans should introduce deliberate instability back into their systems. He argued that they needed to disconnect certain sectors of the fleet to allow for the return of individuality, competition, and even the possibility of failure. He wanted to break the perfect synchronization of the collective to allow for the return of the human spirit. He called it the Great De-Refinement. It was a plea for the return of the messy, the loud, and the inefficient, the very things that had allowed them to survive the Keth in the first place. The debate within the neural grid lasted for a subjective century, processed in the span of a few minutes. The younger leaders, the ones who had been born in the red glow of the Noxus siphons, viewed Thorne's proposal as a form of madness. They saw the collective as the pinnacle of evolution, a state of grace that the Keth had only dreamed of achieving. But the elder minds, those who still carried the phantom pains of Ferrum Prime, understood the truth in Thorne's words. They remembered that the iron was only strong because of the carbon and the impurities that gave it structure. Pure iron was soft, and a pure collective was static. Eventually, the decision was made to designate a cluster of systems on the far edge of the Iron Nebula as unrefined zones. These would be places where the neural link was severed, where technology was restricted to the kinetic and the mechanical, and where humans would be forced to live once again by the sweat of their brow and the friction of their will. As the first ships departed for the unrefined zones, Thorne felt a sense of completion. He watched the vessels, small, ugly things compared to the massive hulks of the collective, burn their way out of the Noxus system. They were filled with volunteers, people who had felt the stifling weight of perfection and chosen the danger of the unknown instead. They were going to worlds where the air scrubbers might fail, where the radiation was a constant threat, and where they would have to build their own future from the raw materials of the ground. They were the new pioneers, carrying with them the books and journals from Thorne's library. They were the return to the architecture of endurance, the beginning of a new cycle of forging. Thorne's own systems began to flicker, the biological components finally reaching the limit of their durability. He did not ask for a replacement or a digital upload. He chose to let the friction of time take its course. In his final moments, he looked out at the great ring and saw a small flicker of light on the horizon, a ship, not of the collective, but of the unrefined, navigating the gaps in the iron lattice. It was a clumsy, stuttering movement, full of errors and corrections, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in centuries. He realized that humanity's greatest strength was not their ability to build a perfect machine, but their inherent inability to ever truly become one. They were a species of the forge, and as long as there was something to break against, they would never be truly broken. The legacy of the Keth-Human War was not a tally of ships lost or planets destroyed. It was the creation of a dual civilization. The collective remained as the guardian of the sector, a massive, silent sentinel of iron and light that ensured no external threat would ever again endanger the human lineage. But orbiting within its shadow was the vibrant, chaotic, and ever-evolving culture of the unrefined. The two halves of humanity existed in a constant state of tension, a perpetual friction that fueled the fires of innovation and growth. The humans had found their equilibrium not in peace, but in the balance between the machine and the soul. They were the masters of the heavy elements, the walkers of the void, and the only species in the galaxy that knew how to turn a catastrophe into a foundation. As Thorne's consciousness finally faded, his last thought was of the miners on Ferrum Prime, standing in the dark with their shovels and their grit, waiting for the sky to fall. He realized then that the sky had never truly stopped falling, they had just gotten better at catching it. The iron was cold now, the forging complete, but the spirit that had hammered it into shape remained. The galaxy was no longer a place of delicate beauty to be admired from afar. It was a workshop, a vast and endless frontier where the weight of unrefined iron would always be the measure of a soul's worth. The human story would continue, not as a symphony, but as the rhythmic, grinding sound of a species that refused to be still.